All right, we should be live. Let me just make sure I don't have anything going. She like usually seeing that we're actually live on a video. Okay, we are live. Great. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Dan, for jumping in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Seattle Data Guy Live on Monday night. I want to bring in some special guests, some people who are actually doing things in the data world. So for those of you who are maybe new or are just jumping in, usually I like to bring in people who are maybe either working in data, creating startups, things of that nature. So for everyone who doesn't know, Pete is the CEO and co-founder of Mozart Data. He has had over a decade kind of running data teams and data adjacent teams at startups in a variety of industries, including gaming, social, HR benefits, cannabis, and so forth. And then he kind of realized that he was seeing the same kind of issues in terms of developing the data stacks or modern data stacks at these various companies. So he's kind of put together Mozart Data to kind of try to ease the process of setting up modern data stacks in this world, as well as he has co-founded a bacon hot sauce company that's been around since 2010. So that's kind of, I think, really fun. And then Dan is kind of the CTO and co-founder of Mozart Data. And he's also kind of worked and developed or worked at a lot of different startups kind of in the space of gaming, with Gamador, GogoCoin in terms of fintech, Clover Health for healthcare, and just a whole host of other spaces. And you both have kind of founded this bacon hot sauce. Is there anything else you guys want to add for an intro?
It's pretty hot intro. You're talking about the co-founders of both Mozart Data and of Bacon Hot Sauce. So it's a pretty warm intro.
Perfect. No, if there's any color you'd like to add, let me know. But I think that's an interesting space, obviously, both data and culinary arts, so to speak. Maybe we can get to why you did that here in a moment. But I guess just so people kind of have some understanding of kind of what you've done and how you've gotten to where you are, how do you guys both kind of get started into tech? And feel free to, if anyone wants to jump in, where you want to jump in.
I mean, I've sort of been programming since I was a little kid. Started programming like BASIC on a Texas Instrument computer like 30 plus years ago. Studied some computer science and math and statistics, was always my favorite subjects throughout high school and college and whatnot. And then got into my first job. I got in like managing a company's advertising. And then from that, just kind of grew, learned how to program to do that better, learned some data stuff to do that better, started working alongside some data people, and then just kind of the rest is history. Like you mentioned, when kind of rattling off my resume, I've worked all sorts of industries, but the problems when you're dealing with data tend to be kind of similar.
Yeah.
My story is a little bit more roundabout. So, I actually kind of came. I sort of fell backwards into tech. So I was an academic. I was studying economics. I was doing my PhD. So I was an applied statistician, and I fell in love. And I went to school and fell in love with the Bay Area. And the best way to stay in the Bay Area for me was to get a job in tech. And ultimately interned at some companies and decided that that sort of application of the statistics to sort of these business problems and technology really sort of appealed to me, and I sort of enjoyed the challenge of it, and also got to do sort of experiments at like the scale that was sort of unimaginable in grad school. When I was in grad school, I was working with data sets that had like a million rows or millions of rows, like exceeding what Excel could do. And that was really powerful. But sort of that transition to the world of, there were data teams that would, give you sort of everything that you could dream of in the sort of analytics space. That was a really sort of special opportunity.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that you kind of started in advertising, because I feel like there's arguably so much, I don't know, it feels like talent in advertising and programming around advertising, which is always kind of funny when you realize that. Were you gonna say something, Pete? Sorry,
Yeah, there's that famous quote that like somebody said, I saw the best minds of my generation, optimizing the the probability of somebody clicks on this ad.
Yeah, I
which
think
was sort of like the sad version of what you're talking about. The flip of it is that you have a lot of great minds that worked in the fields that are sort of all about sort of ads and ads optimization.
yeah, I think that was Elon Musk who decided to just buy a company that focuses on ads,
didn't
or
know
should
that.
be focusing more on ads. I was honestly like, I didn't realize how low Twitter's gross revenue was until this year. I was like, what? Like Facebook's up here at like what, like 160 billion, 200 billion, and you're over here at 3? Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
We'll see if he does more in ads or just sells blue check marks.
That's funny, but yeah, no, it's kind of a sad truth. But when you guys aren't busy kind of managing Mozart, what are you doing outside of work, so people kind of know? Do you guys have lives out there, or is it just Mozart?
Bit of a life. Also, my hobbies are like backpacking and hiking. I like to play tennis and gaming. Pretty standard, mostly strategy card games. I guess the most data relevant hobby I have is fantasy sports.
Oh, nice.
So I'm also sort of a sports gambling junkie. So it's sort of like the application of data analytics to some sort of vice. So like, kind of I actually started my career in the NFL, not as a player, but working sort of in the analytics org of the Philadelphia Eagles. So it was
Nice.
kind of like I'd spent all my time like analyzing sports, and I would like go home and analyze sports.
Nice.
So those are the sort of ideal sort of working conditions. So there is that life outside of Mozart Data, but it happens to involve a lot of things that look pretty similar to using Mozart Data. And then Dan and I also have lives where we're friends. We're friends first. Actually, we've been friends for over 20 years. I don't quite do all the outdoors things that he does, but as you mentioned, we sort of have that joint culinary endeavor. Love sort of having sort of local beers and flavors with friends in the area.
Nice. Oh geez, where did I just was thinking about a question, and now it has eluded me. I'm trying to remember. What did you say before you were answering the bacon hot sauce? Because I had a question on that. I remember, but
the Eagles stuff?
So sports analytics. I was gonna say, the interesting thing there is, I think, I don't know if you know Ken G or Nick Wan. They both do kind of data. Nick Wan's on Twitch, and then Ken G has a pretty big following here. So they both do sports analytics, or at least started that area. So I think that's kind of interesting that there's a lot of people in the sports analytics space. Do you win a lot, or is it merely for fun? Or is that?
I'm not going to quite speak to my record. It's less than ideal. That said, I think one of the reasons that like sports really like provides a lot of great training ground is, one, there is a ton of data. So you have a lot of hobbyists that did like sort of the brutal like legwork of gathering the data, collecting the data, more so than there are people necessarily like optimizing and winning sports bets against it, or like teams optimizing and sort of driving towards championships as a function of it. Like there's just a ton of data out there, and then there's a also really nice, often binary outcomes that are sort of measurable. So often when you're thinking about, say, analyzing a business, you can you can say more revenue is better than less revenue. That may or may not be true in some cases, but it is the case that like winning a championship is better than losing one in sports. So I think it tends to offer up like, one, a lot of great data sets, two, like a lot of like great like just like debates that sort of lead to sort of arguments that can be settled by the data.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. See, it's just makes me think of like Moneyball or something like that, where it's like, yeah, let's actually use data to solve a problem. We'll talk about, I think, the value of data here probably towards the end, but yeah, just like, since a lot of people, I think, on this channel tend to come here because they're curious about careers and how to break into things. What do you think makes kind of like a solid data scientist or a solid data engineer, and kind of what do you look for when you're kind of like hiring for these roles?
I can throw out a couple things beyond sort of the obvious, like math skills, the ability to solve the problems that are given to you. In most cases, I would say something like pragmatism is really important. Like when you study math or statistics in school, there's generally like, here's the one answer that people are looking for. But once you get out into the real world, if you can get to a good enough solution for the problem at hand much more quickly, then like understanding when there's cases where good enough is good enough and when you need to take more time and get to the exact right answer. And I guess I would say related to that is empathy, communication. You're generally building for people inside your own company. So like if you're in, on the other hand, if you're in like a product role, you might need empathy for the users of your company's product. Same thing though, if you're a data person, your products might be for the person sitting next to you or the department over, but you still need to be able to communicate with them, maybe communicate with them in their language rather than in your more technical language, and understand what problem they're trying to solve and what sort of solution is necessary, which kind of goes back to the pragmatism. Don't spend time getting to a perfect solution if good enough you can do in an hour.
Yeah.
I'm pretty adjacent to the pragmatism, which is, I think it's like a good degree of skepticism around data, which I think is like sort of like pairs nicely with pragmatism, which is, I think one of the things that, makes for, a really great data person is the ability to do something incredibly deep and complex and then choosing not to do it. Similarly, sort of that sort of ties really closely to Dan's pragmatism. I also think, there's this concept, it's called Twyman's Law, which is all about like, you see sort of an anomalous piece of data, your instinct and your prior shouldn't be the thing that generated the anomaly was, something good or bad. It's more that it was a data issue. So, I think this comes a little bit with experience, but also I think just sort of some of that rigor towards, thinking about what causes what, is I think one of the most critical like data skills. So thinking about the underlying mechanism and thinking about sort of causal relationships and how you would sort of identify them is something that I think about quite a bit, and it's often one of the most important things that you're doing in sort of analyzing the data.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially I think in like the pragmatic side, because I think I always think like there's this desire, and I think I had this when I started in the data world, to feel smart, right? Like we want to solve hard problems, and then sometimes we want to have a hard solution to solve it. So I think sometimes it's like, yeah, let's build this really big thing, to maybe solve a problem that could have been solved simpler, because I don't know, maybe we want to prove that we're worth what we're getting paid, or maybe we want to prove we're smart. I don't know. I feel like I can kind of empathize with that feeling when you first start getting started in like the data world.
Yeah.
And usually sort of the entry points to the data world is about proving that you can do the really, 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 really hard thing. And then your job involves, counting things.
Yeah.
Right. So, typically sort of the bar is like, oh, you got to be this tall or so, whatever that concept is. And then, your day in, day out life is being, really thoughtful about a lot of basic and simple counts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that makes me think of like interviewing at Facebook, like when the questions they ask you is like, okay, let's say you see like whatever's like hourly active users drop suddenly. What would you do? Like, what's your thought? Like, what's causing it? And then they just want to see like where you go. And so I assume that's kind of what you're referring to.
I mean, there's variants of that at every single company.
Yes.
I think as a practitioner, as someone that looks at a variety of dashboards all the time, most people think that you look at a time series and then, movement up or down, you then sort of have a picture of like what's going right or wrong at the company, when in practice, a vast majority of the time that's, just like a false positive that's being thrown, and then you just have to have a prior about it again. So I think that that's like a very, very common one. One of one of my interview questions always used to be, I worked at a company called Yammer, which is similar to, Facebook was enterprise social network, so sort of just similar to Slack. It's sort of like Facebook at your workplace. And we had this, there was a natural sort of major decline in daily active usage, obviously on weekends, but also on holidays.
Yeah.
So you could see something like July 4th, which would be a huge dip in users, and you'd say, okay, is something wrong? Well, obviously, a plurality of our usage was the United States. So you'd be like, all right, I'm actually just chilling out on a July 4th holiday, please don't bug me. But in practice, you could actually test this by doing something smart, by like looking at other countries and seeing whether or not there was sort of an issue in those countries that don't necessarily celebrate July 4th. And we would have countries like the Netherlands, which would also sort of not be like a huge chunk of our users, but would be a non-trivial one. And then they have like King Day, which is something like it's not like Labor Day I know about, Memorial Day I know about, July 4th I know about, but like King Day in the Netherlands I never knew about until I worked at Yammer, and you'd have to dive in and cut the data to actually observe that kind of non-event.
Yeah, no, I totally get that, because I remember, again, just thinking about, I'm only thinking about MySpace, or MySpace being Facebook, because if anyone ever answered like something about segmentation when we asked that, like a question like that, where it was like, to me, already like bonus point, because so few people would be like, oh yeah, and then we could segment by either age, country, like to try to figure out more into like what's actually causing this, versus just like, yes, something is wrong. It's like, well, it could be, or there could be like a whole host of other things that could be causing this. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And talking about like companies and different sizes of companies, I'm always curious, because I think you guys both have kind of different backgrounds. We were Pete and I were talking about this prior to this, was he's kind of got a background in companies of all sizes. Dan, I think you're a little more on the startup side mostly, and working a lot of that space. So I'd love to know like kind of what your preferences are in terms of like working for a larger company versus startups, and kind of why.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I definitely don't think there's a right or wrong answer. It's definitely like a preference thing. I'm opinionated. I like to be able to have like an influence on product and the business model and marketing and so on. Even if like my title is engineer, it's just harder to do that in my experience. If there's like, there's the marketing department, there's the sales department. And if I'm not part of those, it's harder to have an influence. When if there's maybe 0 or 1 or 2 people that are handling that, I can have kind of more of an influence. Same reason why I enjoy being founder as well. And just as an engineer, I enjoy building, I think this is pretty standard as an engineer, but I enjoy building new products or features or systems from scratch, and working in like a more experimental environment, rather than kind of a big code base where the core of the product is maybe been there for years before I ever got there.
Yeah.
So, I sort of have a flip experience as Dan's a multi-time founder. I'm a first-time founder, although, hot sauce aside, this is my first time as founder. And I've often actually liked the sort of late stage startup. So something that sort of resembles those sort of larger companies that Dan sort of feels less agency in. And I've joined a lot of companies as employee number 100, not actually 100, but like 100 plus or minus a handful. And one of the things about those companies is that they often tend to be growing a lot. They tend to have a lot of data. They have a lot of data challenges and needs. It's a time where you can have a big impact with data. Often very small companies, it is very challenging to have data drive a useful insight that's not essentially core to the founder's worldview, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the flip is at large companies, like much larger. Dan actually most recently worked at a public company. I have worked at a few of those. So the extreme of large companies. And when I think about those companies, the nice part is your little micro optimizations can touch hundreds of millions or billions of people. So I I spent a big chunk of my career working at Microsoft and working on Office, which basically, touches an incredibly vast amount of users. So some optimization that increases those users, experience by just a little has, in some sense, like a massive effect. Whereas when I think about the impact Dan and I have, say, at Mozart Data, that has obviously a much smaller base, sadly, than Office. I think it's harder. That said, Dan and I are having obviously bigger impacts on that company's direction as the co-founders. So there is this sort of trade-off of scale and impact, and different people find different things rewarding. Obviously, as your scale gets bigger, there are some direct benefits often, just to be direct about it in terms of compensation. Larger companies tend to have more sort of, at least cash compensation that tends to be stronger. But sort of as far as, one of the reasons that I found myself more in the startup world as opposed to the public company world, is kind of a variant of what Dan said around impact. But also you see, I think, the greatest career progression in that type of thing. So if you look at your sort of sort of lifetime as sort of your earnings window, I often find that a lot of the best career progression happens when you're able to sort of kind of sit and wear multiple hats, as Dan was mentioning, or sort of go deep or iterate really quickly, or take sort of really giant risks on a variety of different projects. So often, one of the reasons for my preference for, similar to Dan, like startups as opposed to large public companies, tends to not just be about like the actual amount you can impact that company, but also the sort of rapidness that you see and you test different things.
I can definitely like sort of attest to that, just because I had a short stint to startup and then working at a larger big tech fan company. It's like I think everyone assumes you're constantly moving mountains, but it's like, no, you're constantly trying to move 1%, 0.2%. Like, it's because that 0.2% of increase in whatever engagement increases the bottom line by hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's always that battle for like, how do we just move this much? So I think that's funny. I was also like listening to YC Combinator talk like they do a podcast, and they were kind of talking about like, should you join a FANG, or like why you shouldn't. And I think they were really talking to, like, again, that percentage of people that would probably like doing what you guys do, which is taking, I think, a little more ownership, maybe a little more risk, and then creating things and driving things for yourself. So I thought that was an interesting take. So that makes sense. In terms of like kind of finding that for people, because I think, like, when you first start out, you don't necessarily really know what you want. Like, you're like, am I a startup person? Am I a FANG person? Am I a data scientist? Am I a data engineer? Like, where do I belong? Like, how do you recommend people kind of find that through their careers, I guess, as they kind of progress through that whole myriad of options?
Let's say, well, I would say, I mean, not necessarily job hop, but experiment, try some different roles. We might be talking about 2-year timeframes, but try some different things, maybe within your company. Join different teams that are focusing on different things, and experiment that way. As far as like getting jobs in the industry, I'm not a huge proponent of spray and pray. I think it's generally better to like find some companies that you can truthfully tell them why you would really like to work there, as opposed to applying everywhere that has an opening and kind of hoping. And then if you don't yet have the skills to pass those interviews, if possible, I'm a big fan of building things, learning in your spare time. We have things like YouTube that have a lot of distractions, but also have more scholarly information than the Library of Alexandria. So we can learn really quickly. This industry is changing very, very fast. The companies and the libraries that we're building on top of, most of them didn't exist, 5-ish years ago. So you can learn the new thing, and you'll be caught up pretty quickly if you have the spare time to learn. But it only takes a few minutes a day if you stick to it.
I have some parts that I agree with and some parts that I disagree with.
Perfect.
I'm not going to say that spray and pray is the right answer, but I do think that sort of the best jobs on paper do not marry up necessarily to what ends up being sort of the job that you love the best. And actually, I mentioned how much I love the idea of doing sports analytics, and I had always sort of done sports analytics as sort of a fun hobby, and then that actually ended up being one of the entry points for me into the world, sort of transitioning from being an academic into the world of doing sort of analysis. But actually, it wasn't one where I had a lot of like passion for it, like in the role. So it was one that sort of matched everything I wanted on paper, and in practice, I found a lot more fulfillment working in like Facebook games that like I kind of like despised playing and was sad about sort of being so pervasive and prevalent. And like so I think it's sort of a little bit harder to predict kind of what you'll love. So the sort of rifle shot approach of saying, okay, these are like my 4 favorite companies, and I'll figure out a way into one of these 4 companies because I really love using taking vacations and using Airbnb or something like that, or hopping in the back of an Uber. That's not really the you're not necessarily going to find the sort of like enjoyment around the context. It's more about the agency that the data has at that company, which is a little bit harder to see from the outside. Of course, you should do your diligence as you're sort of maybe accepting an offer, but it's a little bit harder to see sort of, I think, in the moment. So I'm a big fan of having a pretty wide list. So not full spray and pray, but like I call it buckshot as opposed to rifle shot. So having a wide list, and sadly, the best way to break in is very aggressive, second and third degree LinkedIn connecting.
Yeah.
I do think, I actually, I would apply to jobs, and I had a great academic background, and I would apply to, and I had actually like a wonderful set of internships. I would apply to jobs that literally like the description would like, it seems like a wanted poster of me. And of course I would never hear back. And then the second that I could get one of my friends to submit me for a role, I would actually hear back. In fact, Dan helped me get one of my first jobs in tech. So so I do think the best way to break into the profession, of course, is to cheat. And anybody who tells you otherwise is probably neglecting how they themselves did it. To really leverage your network, because a reference goes 100 times farther than an application. So you should be whether that's seeking out informationals, seeking out second or third degree connections, and great people are willing to recommend great people to roles. It's just it's a nice to do. It shouldn't be a burden. That said, you should have done your homework on these companies. Sort of all the things that you would do if you were going more rifle shot. Namely, if you were to learn a lot about the companies and the specifics of kind of what make them unique, and then whether you get an informational or whatever, it tends to be a tough road, but that tends to be the way that you break in. And then typically, if you're at a company, kind of like Dan mentioned, where you can experiment, it's so much easier to sort of have multiple roles at a company if you're succeeding in what they hired you to do. Yeah. So, actually, if I think about sort of at Mozart Data, our company, a lot of folks, maybe they don't exactly job hop within the company, but often, for instance, our product manager, at his previous company, had roles in sort of operations and analytics, and was very, very successful in there before effectively moving into more of a product role. So it's a lot easier to jump function within company. And similarly, it's also easier to jump level within company. So if I want to hop from company to company, it's maybe a little bit harder to both hop function and level. Whereas, if you're succeeding at a company, often those steps, those career steps come a lot faster than you might imagine, especially at smaller companies where you have a little bit more agency and ability to demonstrate sort of your wins.
Yeah. No. I think everything you guys said made sense. I remember when I was first trying to break in, one of my friends who worked at Amazon was like, "Look, I can get you the referral. You'll get an interview, but it's up to you. After that, it's up to you. It's like I can get you the referral. That's it." So yeah, definitely a great cheat code. I've definitely seen people like I think took like a year to get my first job, and then I've seen other people use a referral and like immediately start getting interviews. So if you guys know people, I'd say, yeah, that's always the route to go. I think one interesting thing I have there is like how like, because you said like second or third connections. How do you recommend people, like, not to go off the question list, but how do you recommend people go like and reach out to people on LinkedIn in such a way that, like, because I've gotten plenty of people who are like, hey, can you refer me somewhere? And it's like, I don't know them. And, so to me, I'm like not always inclined. So how do you recommend people kind of like break that barrier between someone they might not know that well to like get a referral somewhere?
I think a lot of that is homework. So if somebody reached out to me out of the blue and said, "Hey, Fish, I noticed that Seattle Data guy who worked at Facebook. Can you get me an interview at Facebook?" Well, like, one, I know a number of people that work at Facebook. You could. Yeah, so but so do many other people. And, like, what is it about, which team at Facebook, what do you care about this company? Like, what's interesting about what they're doing? All of these are very sort of simple to read sort of on the internet. So I think generally it starts with having like a little bit of an appreciation of the person's time. I work as the co-founder of Mozart Data. I don't work as like a recruiter, for folks out there. But I think, like, generally there's a willingness to honestly pay it forward. And at Y Combinator, for instance, when you recommend somebody or recommend a startup, there's different degrees of recommendation, right? So sometimes there's this person reached out to me and asked for a recommendation, and that's a light recommendation, but people take you at your word. So you're spending social capital in that recommendation, but a little amount. And then there's like, this person, like, I would chop off my left hand to, to see them succeed or whatever it is. And I know they'll be amazing at whatever they do. So there is sort of that spectrum. And I think, you as a recommender, I think want to do kind of what's right in the universe, which is to say, okay, this is, how I know this person, how I'd recommend. But companies are hungry for talent, and actually, like, getting even a soft recommendation from somebody that's seen you demonstrate some excellence at something, and that can just be the homework on the company, I think is a really great place to start.
Yeah, I like that. I don't know if Dan, if you have anything to add, or
no, that's good. I don't really play that game.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on something, which is like, just treat the other person's time as also valuable, because it's like,
So yeah, one of the things that I do there is, if somebody reached out for me to do a recommendation, or maybe a VC intro, if you're interested in starting a company and looking for funding, if I have to, like, sort of craft the email and, like, write sort of the things that are top of mind. I mean, this is like anything. You want to make it, just if I'm designing a website, like if I'm designing, Mozart Data's marketing site, I don't want somebody to have to, like, solve like an interview problem that involves a bunch of, complexity in order to, set up a demo. We want them to quickly be able, in the same way that, like, when you're working at Facebook, and if you're working on the growth team at Facebook, they're trying to figure out ways to quickly onboard you to Facebook, or get you to add more friends, or whatever that sort of, success metric is of making it easy. And the same sort of applies to, job seeking, which is to say, if you make it easy, if you make sort of the reasons that this role appeals to you, if you give me the specific role, if you sort of give me the specific person that you'd like an intro to, all of this kind of makes my job easier, and you're going to have a much higher conversion rate.
Yeah. I like how you just turn this into like, yeah, how frictionless can you make it, like a SaaS product? It's like, can you make it one click? Just make it one click, and I will refer you.
I'll just say, like, I spend my whole day thinking about making onboarding frictionless. So, like, unsurprisingly, I think it applies to many dimensions of my life.
Yeah. Oddly enough, that's why I usually tell people a lot of other startups are gonna have, like in the data space, have a hard time, because it's like, look, you're competing against like AWS, which like their conversion rate is create new environment. Like it's a hard gambit to run when the other option is, okay, talk to an AE and then make a contract, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very different game. But speaking kind of on that bigger picture level of like companies, I also, since you guys have both again worked at varying levels of companies and driven value in many ways, and I think one of the big things that we don't talk enough about in the data space, or maybe we do, just more on the analyst side, which is driving value with data. So how have you both kind of seen companies or yourselves driven like value with data in the past?
I can maybe give what I think is a pretty broad, good use of data. So I worked at Clover Health. They're a Medicare Advantage health insurance company that is very proactive about improving the health of their members. So I would say this is more like using data in operations, which to me is a lot about getting the right data to the right person in the right context at the right time, not too much data, not too little data. So like, for example, we have tons of information, tons of medical information, tons of like compiled information about our members. And then the challenge was to build tools or make it easy for others to build tools to get the right view of that data. So like a nurse in a member's house might need one view of data, which is totally different than a customer support person in the call center, which is totally different than a finance person looking at things in aggregate, which is totally different from a doctor, et cetera. So that I thought was a very interesting challenge and a good example of just like operations across the board, helping people kind of see the data that is most useful to them, which often means not just like giving them as much as possible, but understanding kind of how they're going to be using it in the moment.
And I have probably a little bit less of like a hands-on example. I think with Dan, the Clover Health example always like strikes me as really salient, because you can imagine sort of these health outcomes impacted. And I've mostly worked at like SaaS companies, so it's like it's a lot more lame to say, well, like when you add this frictionless component, the conversion rate increases and the company makes more money, and then everybody like can go to a cooler happy hour or have like nicer swag. Now, I actually don't want to demean that work, because one, I have spent like a majority of my career doing that work, and I have maybe if I'm going to go with first a cool example. So I worked most recently at a company called Ease. Ease is or at some point was sort of the world's largest like cannabis marketplace, largely exclusively in California. So we were like almost like an Uber Eats, but just serving cannabis products. And one of the things that we did there, much like Uber or Lyft, you'd have to forecast demand in some sense to have the right numbers of like drivers and product on the road. So kind of the coolest way to kind of like see the value was using data to best predict sort of the optimal menu, to best predict sort of the demand and the drivers, and that would essentially create sort of the virtuous cycle of having the right number of drivers on the road would lead to sort of the lowest like cost per delivery. That costs effectively would get split and passed on to the customer. And cannabis, like most consumer goods, is highly elastic. So essentially in the same way that Uber and Lyft are trying to sort of figure out all these complex data problems because it feeds into sort of a typical marketplace virtuous cycle, we had the same thing. So having systems that would if demand were light, we would sort of automate the sending of coupons, which was like a great demand generation. And if you've lived in California and have been a cannabis consumer in California, you've almost certainly seen an Ease coupon come your way. So there were sort of real world tangible things in my work. That said, like the way that most companies derive a lot of value from data is it starts with very basic things, mostly just counts and reporting that that save a lot of like minutia work. I think a lot of kind of what step one of analytics is being able just to count very basic things about your business. And the way that that gets done without sort of data sophistication is not like people using their fingers, but it's like, a lot of what, and I used to work, for Microsoft. I worked specifically on Excel. So a lot of that work would be repetitive or done in spreadsheets, which again, Excel is, a great, effectively BI tool. But ultimately, there's a variety of modern tooling that can make a lot of spreadsheet work sort of obsolete. And so it starts with essentially like counts of core things, and you start to get into like much greater sophistication, a much greater understanding of the customer. Typically, this involves multiple sources of data. So, things like understanding kind of how long a customer is going to stick around. What what can you expect, or what's the risk of churn of that customer? What's the value of the channel or what's the value of a typical customer from a given channel? So you can do, again, some of this ads optimization that we talked about earlier. These are some of the very initial or important questions that companies get value from their data with, because ultimately some of their biggest cost centers are either de facto churns or reactivations of their customers, or just getting them into the platform in the first place. So that's unsurprisingly where most companies see a lot of value in their data initially.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, and I'm kind of glad you said, like, sometimes it's just about counting or things of that nature. I definitely have a few projects like that where it's like, we're not even sure how many customers we have, which is like, I think everyone assumes our data world is much farther than it is, and I'm just like, sometimes it depends, like, depends on the company you work at. So I think it's interesting. Also, you said like different channels and like the value from different channels, and I was like, that's how I think about like YouTube occasionally. I think earlier I referenced like like the attention economy, and I'm like, yeah, like I literally will like look at, it's like, okay, if they came on this term, they spent 10 minutes on my video, but if they came on this term, they spent like 3 minutes on my video. And so I kind of, in a weird way, look at it that same way, because it's like, yeah, I just want to know what are people looking for, what's providing value for who. So I think that's interesting. So in terms of like, like setting up like a data organization, like what have you seen in terms of like companies that set up like successful data organizations? Kind of what are like some hallmark maybe pillars that you think from these companies or from these data teams kind of exhibit excellence?
Let's see, I have a few thoughts. Like buy-in from the top certainly helps. If it's not kind of like a data-driven organization, then you'll just have trouble where actually decisions are made based on seniority or politics or things like that. So if there's no buy-in at the top, then it's going to be hard to have much of an impact. This isn't necessary, but empowering, when the data team is like empowering other people throughout the org to ask and answer their own questions, that can be really powerful. The alternative, which is also fine in many cases, is just, we are the data team, we have a queue, here's how you ask us questions, and then we will figure out what's most important, or some people figure out what's most important, and then we answer those questions and we present to you the dashboard or the spreadsheet or whatever. That's fine, but if you can do it, empowering the rest of the org, and instead of answering people's questions, you're building tools for them to answer their own questions, that can be kind of the best case scenario. And then sort of related to that, I would say in general, if people have a culture of being data driven, you want to like figure out the metrics in advance. So like before you release a new product, or before, the question is, should we do X? Before you ship it, figure out how you're going to measure it, figure out what success is going to look like. Basically, because it's much easier sort of before people are like being defensive about it. it's easier to get to truth and easier to get to agreement on what success will look like and kind of what you should be measuring. Where if you do that after the fact, people might be looking at the data differently to defend their position, and you can get into a little bit more of politics. So kind of that can help you get to an attitude of we're all in this together. We all just want to get to truth. We're not, defending our positions or anything like that, which is, I think, a nice thing.
That's funny.
I'd echo a lot of that. The currency of all startups is basically trust. So when the data organization is the center of trust, that's a great thing. There's a lot of nuance to some of Dan's answer around, executive buy-in. So sometimes they'll write a blank check to, buy all the fanciest of tools and hire all the expensivest of consultants and, do like X, Y, and Z. That's not really the answer, because you actually, well, it's probably positively correlated. That correlation's not one. I think a lot of times, folks invest in data to, have like a pillow that they can lean on, right? Like that it's supposed to just sort of back up their intuitions. I think often what creates a successful data organization, and this is what I've personally seen, is a lot of luck. So when I was at Yammer, about 3 months into my stint running the analytics group there, we ran an experiment that had a counterintuitive result, and it was not just statistically significant, it was economically significant. It was one of our biggest lifts. Now, that happened 3 months into my tenure there, but honestly, it was certainly the biggest counterintuitive result that we saw, and one of the biggest results that we saw ever. And as a result, like the team and experimentation got funded, not excessively. I loved the team and the capabilities of the team, but the team got a lot of buy-in. And had that happened 3 years into my tenure or 10 years into my tenure, which, basically was the expected wait time to find a result like that, that wouldn't have actually happened. So, I think the reason that you ask it is like, what's actionable if you're a data leader, watching this, and I think, Dan brings up a really clear tension point in his answer where, you want to sort of decentralize as much of sort of busy work as possible. You don't want to be sort of this, ticket taker on all of the basic sort of asks. And what I find is when there is that sort of queue of doing it, teams will sort of answer or hire for answers themselves, which tends to lead to decentralized analytics, which often at a lower bar and often, with a lot of tension around resourcing. So there is this sort of delicate sort of balance that Dan was touching on that I wholeheartedly echo. I think we've probably all seen it in our careers, but I think a lot of that ultimately comes down, a successful data organization, much like many things in life, I think is about the virtuous cycle, which is, you get some results, you get more trust gives you more sort of latitude to make, investments that sometimes pan out as, maybe these are ad hoc analyses that you're doing that you're hoping sort of yield something fruitful that the company should be doing, or maybe it's that ability to push back and say, hey, I want to answer your question about how many users in Germany have sent 4 messages on a Tuesday, but never 3 messages on a Monday. But I need just like a little bit of time to answer something else that's pressing, and having the agency to do that. So I think so much of it ends up being, creating those virtuous cycles, which can, obviously the best way to get there is by being lucky and having sort of the wins to back it up. The second best way to do it is to, essentially, prove whether that's sort of upwards in terms of the executives that you make good ROI investments in your sort of analytics, or whether it's sort of proving that, sideways or diagonal or whatever direction that, your stakeholders are.
Yeah. That makes me think of like politics. How it's always like, well, hopefully something good happens while you're in office, or if something bad happens, it's also your fault. So you just kind of got to roll with the punches. So yeah, that's I think it's always interesting.
Yeah.
Like when they hire data scientists, I think at larger companies, it's like often they say like, we expect you to do something in like 2 years, or like research scientists. Like hopefully you give a good ROI in that space. But
Yeah,
yeah.
they say a lot of like governor popularity is driven by like oil prices, which of course the governor has no agency in whatsoever.
Yeah.
There's sort of a lot of robust results about that, and I feel a little bit like data teams are sometimes the same way.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, I want to make sure we're mindful of time, and so somehow it's already 7:50. So I am kind of curious about your guys' view about like where data goes in the next 10 years, but maybe we can just do a quick answer on that and then jump into QA.
Wait, we missed talking about failures of data,
Ah.
which is like my favorite topic. I mean, like that to me is like the best one.
All right. Let's talk about let's talk about that, and then we'll skip the 10 years.
All right,
What?
I'm just going to give a very quick answer to this, and
Yeah.
then we can jump into the. Dan can give a 10-year answer, but I'm going to give a failures answer. So, I think in our intros you mentioned that Dan and I started a hot sauce company together. 10 years ago. We sort of jokingly say that we had a failed sort of DTC hot sauce company, and we just couldn't get the data we needed from Shopify, so we had to pivot and make a data platform that could really help us consume that data. So that's kind of how we ended up stuck doing Mozart Data instead of being hot sauce entrepreneurs for forever. So that is at least the story that I'm going with today. But an insight that I often talk about and I give as an example is that actually, if you look at the earliest cohorts of users, they were incredible. Basically, they had incredible retention, incredible net dollar retention, just incredible. Now, one of the things to note about some of the earliest users is they had my last name, right? So, my mom was buying a lot of my hot sauce, and basically, if everybody, purchased, bacon hot sauce the way my mom purchased bacon hot sauce, obviously Dan and I wouldn't be doing Mozart Data, but not only that, we'd be like Jeff Bezos, right? Like we would be, or Elon Musk, we would be buying Twitter today. So, I would say that, one of the typical things I like to talk about is, there has to be some sort of deep understanding of the data and the data generating process. Like what is, I think one interpretation is, women in New Jersey that, go to the Bacon Hot Sauce website. Now my mom is a woman from New Jersey, end up just like massively loving bacon hot sauce. And therefore we just need to run tons of Facebook ads and just target, women in Monmouth County, New Jersey, right? It's like, well, that would be the much more obvious interpretation. And of course, the thing that was generating it was my mom loved giving bacon hot sauce as a gift, or consuming it. I think often where companies tend to have like these data failures, obviously there's many things that, I think are driven by, data infrastructure issues or by, data organization issues, but often the driver is, often like a misunderstanding of what is generating the relevant data. And the example that I give is so corny. That wasn't actually like Dan and I didn't waste a ton on like Google and Facebook ads for New Jersey. That was not what ultimately caused us to pivot from bacon hot sauce. But I think one of the things that I do see as a common issue is sort of the ability to think about the data and understand the business of the data.
That makes sense. Yeah. I think you mentioned that earlier, like thinking about where it's coming from, think what's generating it. Think a little deeper than just like, oh, these numbers are going up. But why? I don't know if Dan, you wanted to say anything about 10 years, or if you wanted to jump into QA.
I'll just say one quick thing. The nice thing I think about specifically 10 years or approximately 10 years, that's just enough time that you can kind of cheat and say what big companies are doing right now that are putting in a lot of money into big teams. 10 years from now, that'll be easier to do and like cheap enough that many companies will be doing that. So, you know, that's stuff like having a modern data stack, having a central data warehouse, pulling all of your data into it, and kind of having those systems be robust with data governance and probably things like machine learning. I'm pretty bullish on machine learning, and right now still it's mostly bigger companies putting heavy investment into it. I think that'll be much more common because it'll be cheaper and the tooling will just be a lot better and easier to use.
Yeah, no, I definitely that definitely was it feels like is a very straight line, right? Like it's like do it big companies. Someone at the big companies like I could productionize, make this entire product, go out, make product, get funding. Now you can do ML ops or something much easier.
Yep.
So yeah,
Exactly.
seems like a pretty straightforward route. All right, so I know it's already 7:55. So there are definitely a few questions in here. So I was going to kind of jump in and pull this one in. So someone was asking, can I start in the data engineering space at the age of 40, starting from scratch? Do you guys have any insights on how they can maybe either speed that up? Because personally, my answer is yes, but I'd love to hear your guys' side and how to get there faster, maybe.
I definitely want to say yes. I don't know what the best way to start is. It would depend sort of where you're starting from. Whether that's like you have some math background, you have some statistics background. If you have no background in any of this, I'm not exactly sure where the best place to start. Something like Coursera, something like YouTube videos.
I would say, again, it depends a little bit about the background. So the best data engineers I know didn't start as data engineers. Dan, effectively was a software engineer. Some of my favorite data engineers started as data analysts, data scientists, and sort of had that sort of, statistical mindset, and then essentially picked up the relevant parts of the engineering that were gonna, drive some of the needs there. So again, I'd look to the background and also understand that a lot of folks get data engineering opportunities from very adjacent roles. So, working as a data analyst and analytics engineer, it's only kind of like a few steps to be working sort of on sort of data engineering pipelines.
Yeah. I would also say, like, you might not have been doing any data engineering for the first 40 years of your life, but you were doing something. And there's a decent chance you can find a data engineering role that will take advantage of that. If it's only like the people skills, you're good at communicating, or maybe some industry because you've worked in it for 20 years. So that can also be kind of a good cheat code.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I like the moving ladder, or basically laterally, because I think that's what I usually tell people. It's like, well, don't bank on it the first role, but like data analyst is usually easier to break into, and then from there, like you said, it's very adjacent. Like there's a lot of stuff you can add in there. Someone else was asking about the interview process when we were talking about interviews. So I guess do you guys have any thoughts on that? I know like there's all sorts of thoughts on like what's the right way to interview. So do you have any thoughts about current interview process? I think they probably mean mostly data structure and algorithm style questions and code style questions. So any thoughts on that? How, if there's a better way?
Pete?
Full disclosure. Okay. So full disclosure is we internally do a fair amount of that, right? So when we interview for engineer, when we interview for data scientists, when we interview for honestly like SDR, right? Like, I think we have what are typically, called like whiteboard exercises, or we have folks pair or do something. I think in general, what tends to be broken is not sort of the mechanism for identifying skills, but like the selection mechanism. Dan and I have a very strong opinion. Actually, it comes from I read Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, and we're big believers in interviewing for strength. So one of the things that you see, I think, where I think companies tend to get it wrong is, there'll be sort of a bar that, somebody has to meet on sort of, 8 dimensions or 15 dimensions or a zillion dimensions. And like, it turns out they make 14 of the 50 up. That's an instant reject, and I think there are sort of disqualifiers, right? So, the standard is the no assholes policy, which I think is actually a good disqualifier. But more accurately, where I see the interview process being broken is not really trying to understand a person's strengths. So that might mean requiring, the code to be written in a certain language, or, especially when adjacent ones can be picked up rather quickly. And these are, by the way, while it's frustrating, this is also our opportunity. So one of the ways that, Dan and I can't compete with, say, Facebook, in terms of opportunity, and the way that we think that you get there is by sort of identifying kind of, I think basically skills that are potentially missed through that interview process.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the missing of skills, and because that is the hard thing, especially when you're trying to meet a bar. Like I probably did, I think I did like 150 plus interviews at Facebook, and it's just like, it's a machine, guys. That's all it is. Like, did you hit this number of questions? Did you, how many hints did you need? Like, it's very pretty much an algorithm, right? Like being very if then else basic algorithm. Like, no, I can't really. This is just the system that it is. But like, obviously in smaller companies, I think you have a little more wiggle room. You can see a little more, and you don't have to like process hundreds of interviews in a week. It is 8:00, so I don't like. Are you guys good to keep going, or do you want to like? If you guys want to, maybe like I can 5-10 more minutes, or
yeah, let's do another 10 minutes. One thing that I want to add that I think is important is that small companies actually have a different sort of cost trade-off than, say, Facebook does.
Yeah.
So for us, type 1 and type 2 error, so a false positive or false negative, has a very different cost, and in particular, I would say that for us, when you're early, making a hiring mistake is particularly, costly. So in general, one of the things that I do think, if you're early career, I think, or sort of more junior, I think it's generally a little bit easier to break in actually at larger companies, even though those companies tend to have sort of the classic, pitfalls, and they all sort of have very, very similar interview styles. So, we tend to, I think, be a little bit more open to missing out on potentially great candidates, because I think when you're an early company, there's a huge risk to making the wrong hire, and that can be culturally, that can also be technically.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, right? Like you said, like at a company like Facebook, there's like 1,000 data engineers. If 3% of them are bad, or maybe not the best hire, it's like the other 97% are going to cover the difference, and that'll be fine. But for you, it's like you have, I don't know how many, 3. One is bad. Now it's a significant output drop. Speaking more technical questions, so someone was kind of a little more curious. Oh, sorry, I'm covering someone's face. Sorry, Dan. I'll move this here in a second. But as a data engineer without much experience in like Hadoop and Spark, they've been using Python and SQL and Airflow. Are they missing anything by not using Hadoop and Spark? And is that a big problem for their career? Because I think the notion they're kind of stating here.
I've never used Spark or Hadoop for one, so I don't think so. Have you?
Yeah, again, it relates to what type of company that you're looking to get a job at. If you think that's skating to where the puck is going, I challenge that a little bit, but I would also say that I think all of the things that you've listed are like the core to what we see at early and even mid-stage and even sort of late-stage startups. So it really depends on sort of where you're trying to go in your career. But I think that there's tons of runway for literally the skill set that you talked about. In fact, that feels like, to me, even more so where the world is going, if you could develop depth in any one of those.
Huge majority of companies don't have a need for Spark, Hadoop sized or sorts of systems.
Yeah, I think you asked me earlier. I think you asked me, like, did you? No, or at least not straight. Like, we use Presto and Spark, but it was like in a very abstracted way, right? Like it was like SQL on top of that. Like that's how we used it, right? So obviously there are companies, I think like Airbnb is a big Spark proponent, but on it. Like I like to, like, in a weird way, I've realized that you could work a lifetime in data engineering or data infrastructure and never touch like 80% of the tooling that exists and get your job done, especially in the current world and how it's operating.
It's only
There's so many
getting
tools.
worse.
Yeah, it's only,
Yeah.
it's only
Should also say, if you've learned Python, SQL, AWS, Airflow, you could learn Spark and Hadoop if the need arose. So.
Exactly. I think it's the other thing in the tech world. I usually tell people, it's like, learn your core foundation, like your Python, SQL, cloud. After that, you'll learn what you need when you need it, right? Like, okay, now you need this thing, now let's learn it. Because otherwise you'll just spend your time like, I think there was like, I learned like Spring Framework and I haven't used it. It might be if I ever go that direction, maybe more on the website, sure, but I don't use it. There's a lot of examples of just like, yeah, you're gonna spend a lot of time just learning things that way that you'll never end up using. So I think it's not the end of the world. Okay, so speaking of like more on the tech stack, how do you decide what tools and tech stacks to use when starting a data team while considering things like scale and cost? By the way, then the last part's more for me, but thank you for that last part. But yeah, what do you guys think on that question?
Well, congrats on starting at Twilio. That should be a fun journey.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
Dan?
I mean, I'm a huge Python fan. I don't know. I just kind of keep up with what's the best, and I try to choose the best for that job. I'm usually erring super on the side of pragmatic. So like, if we know something and it's good enough, go with that. I don't know. That's not the best answer. Pete, any thoughts? Oh,
well, obviously a couple of things on the tooling side and tech stack side. I've got a biased answer about a great set of tools to use. I'm very partial to something in particular. So, I think for a lot of startups, I'm a huge fan of obviously what we do at Mozart Data, which is sort of the easiest way to spin up a data stack, but also the underlying technologies that we've chosen. I think are ultimately how I see, what I see as the sort of the right way to think about tooling. So what that means is centralizing your data in a cloud data warehouse, and then using EL tools to effectively make that happen, transforming your data, and then using it downstream in terms of reverse ETL and BI. So, I think like at the very least, the standard sort of way of thinking about that is right. There's other little slices of the T space that we think about that many others are starting to think about. But ultimately, I'm a huge fan of getting this stuff spun up incredibly quickly and getting going and doing things is just about as important as the technologies that you're choosing.
Yeah, don't over engineer for scale that you probably will never have and definitely won't have for years, and by then everything will be different. So make a good decision for now and the immediate future.
Yeah.
Dan, how did you miss that layup?
Sorry.
Yeah, so someone's in the crowd, but that makes me think of, I remember reading like the Netflix article where I think they talked about when they went to streaming, and like they had like 6 months or like 8 months of like window, basically like, we have to go from OLAP to streaming like now. And I think that's like arguably the better way of doing it. It's like, look, you probably don't need to think about streaming until you need to think about streaming. Like they were like, we have no option. Now we need to do it. All right, we can probably do one more question, and thank you everyone for who's been here. And if we apologize for the questions we don't get to, I think this is more of a career question, so that's why I'm going to put it up. Which is, hey guys, making 50K as a junior data engineer. I have 6 months of experience at this company. Should I be looking to jump ship sooner than 1 year, or stick it out with this peanut salary? I have thoughts, but I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts in terms of, how they should kind of progress with their career.
I mean, I think it's a little bit overstated, the whole like, don't become a job jumper. If you have good reasons, if you can explain why you were at some job for 6 months, if it comes up in an interview, that's usually enough. I would say though, if you enjoy your job and you're learning a lot and you're progressing in your career, I would err on the side of trying to get a better salary where you are. Asking for a raise often works, and people don't do that enough. If that doesn't work, then yeah, I think jumping ship is fine. Maybe don't jump. But it would be if I heard that on an interview, if I said, why did you stay at this job only for 6 months? And you said I was making $50K and then I got a $100K offer this other job. Okay, that makes total sense.
I mean, I would wholeheartedly back up that answer. I do think people are a little bit reticent to either go through the interview process again or all of those things. But I'm somebody, and Dan is too. We've both done a lot of career jumping. Most of my career stints have been only 2 years long, which is actually not at all abnormal in the Valley. Mozart just turned 2, so that's like exciting. It's now one of the longest jobs I've ever held. So hopefully Dan doesn't fire me in the next few weeks. But more so than that, I do think it's important to think actually about sort of lifetime earnings. Dan and I are founders, and actually, for the first, I think, year of Mozart, we both were sort of unpaid. So, we weren't like quitting the company over that. We thought like, okay, there's a real opportunity. And obviously the founder is the extreme version of this, but, I spent most of my 20s in graduate school earning $14,000 a year living in the Bay Area. So, I had sort of that mentality then of there was sort of a lifetime of earnings to come after sort of completing, my education. And I think the same sort of applies here. So it's less about kind of what your salary is and more about kind of, again, sort of the pace of learning, the pace of sort of expansion of your potential salary, and also the willingness of the company to be on your side. And ultimately, when you are sort of in a role that's worthy of more money, that gets recognized and gets recognized fairly quickly. One of the things that Dan and I have implemented at Mozart is a shorter yet smaller salary review that typically what you see at larger companies, and you probably had this at Facebook, and I certainly had this at Microsoft, is you're at a certain level, and then every 2 years, if you're sort of on pace, you jump up a level, and then with that comes a salary increase, where that doesn't seem like the right model, because about half the time you're above that level, and then like a quarter of the time you're below that level, and then a quarter of the time that you're at that level. So I think like it's important that companies, especially if you're at sort of a smaller one, recognize your progress and do so. And sometimes that's incumbent upon yourself to bring that up to their attention, and sometimes it'll happen sort of naturally. But sort of having that sort of mutual alignment about, hey, I'm going to get reviewed appropriately, I think is a really important feature of a workplace, where whatever you're doing, whether you're a junior DE, whether you're the CEO, whether you're fresh out of college, whether you've got 50 years of experience, doesn't really matter.
Yeah, no, I like the view of like, think about it from a lifetime value thing in terms of like, what could this gain me later? Like, again, I think Gary Tan says like, right, either learn or earn. If you're learning a ton of stuff, it could be worth it, right? Like in the long run. I like the example, because I don't remember if I told you this before, Pete, but I worked in fine dining, and like you have to like stage, which basically means work for free for months. And like, so I worked for free for a really good restaurant in Seattle, and then had a job wherever I wanted, basically going forward. So sometimes it's like, yeah, you take that hit early, and then eventually it hopefully pays off. I also have thoughts about unpaid internships, but besides that, no, I totally agree that it's like, yeah, sometimes it's worth to take that hit if it means you either learn more, you get connected with the right people. But if you're not doing either of those things, then I mean, it's going to take you 6 months to switch your job anyways. So you're going to have a year-long experience, which is probably enough. It's probably better you switch personally. Yeah. Well,
I also think the model of being at a place for a year or 2 years or whatever it is, I do think that's a little bit of a dated concept. It's not great to perpetually job hop, but I do think that usually you get passes on one or more of those.
Yeah.
And I'm sad that you're not the Seattle fine dining guy.
I had a website called 86 Chef. 86. I don't know if.
Yeah, I know when you 86 something.
Yeah. So I was like, it was basically after I left the culinary industry. So I was like, I'm 86th from cooking. Yeah, it was fun. But the last restaurant I worked at, like everyone, like they would do like a quick check on who was coming in, and they would be like, someone from Amazon, someone from Google, someone. And I was like, I want to be that person. Like, I'm over here, like, working my ass off, and then those people are just coming in and having a great.
Ironically, 3 of the best people I know in the data space have like deep restaurant experience, like later in their careers.
I worked my first job like right after college was at a fancy pizza place.
Nice.
And basically a few weeks in, they're like, "Can you be more chipper?" And I'm like, I don't think this is for me, actually.
Yeah. For me, it was the I think in 5 years I went from $10 an hour to $15 an hour, and then I saw the people at 30, 30 years old, were making the same amount, and I was like, so mathematically, this is going to be a bad investment for me. I need to switch now. So that was kind of it. Well, guys, thank you so much for your time. Again, I don't want to take too much of your time, and I really appreciate all of your answers. I think there was a ton of knowledge that everyone got. And other than that, thank you guys. And sorry for everyone's QA that I missed. Hopefully you guys, we'll probably do a longer QA at some point in the future. But yeah, if you guys have any last final words, let me know. Otherwise, we can kind of end it here.
Thanks for having us. This was fun.
Yeah, great to be on.
All right. Thank you guys, and I will hit end broadcast.